The ultrasound images slipped from Nomi Peterson's trembling fingers and scattered across the polished mahogany desk of James Watson's corner office, like evidence presented at a trial where the verdict had already been decided. But James had already delivered his judgment without glancing at a single grainy image of the two lives growing inside her. This channel delivers deeply emotional, dramatic stories inspired by strength, pain, love, and resilience. Every story explores moments of betrayal, sacrifice, healing, and unexpected twists, told with cinematic intensity and raw emotion that stays with you. Please hit the like button, subscribe to The Ultimate Story, drop comment where you are watching us from in the comment section, and lastly turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. You really think I'd fall for this again? James stood with his back to her, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's financial district, his reflection warped in the tinted glass. A stranger wearing the face of the man Nomi thought she knew. His voice carried that particular ice reserved for people wealthy men believe have tried to deceive them. A tone she'd heard him use with opposing attorneys and hostile investors, but never, until this devastating moment, with her. Nomi knelt to gather the images, her knees buckling, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward and degrading. She pressed the ultrasound photos against her chest as though they were evidence of something sacred, though James had already made it brutally clear that evidence meant nothing when measured against his suspicion. "James, please. Just look at them. The doctor said what you paid him to say." He turned from the window, and the late afternoon sun behind him cast his face in shadow, unreadable and distant. "You think I don't know how this works? Women target men like me constantly. You were just more convincing than most. I'll give you credit for that." The words struck like calculated blows, each one precisely aimed at the foundation of everything they'd built together over 2 years. Nomi had braced herself for shock, perhaps even for questions, but she hadn't prepared for this, for the complete demolition of their shared history, their intimacy, their whispered promises at his lake house under stars that had seemed eternal. She watched him move to the bar cart built into the office wall, his movements controlled and mechanical, pouring scotch into crystal with the same measured precision he applied to hostile takeovers and contract negotiations. The sound of liquid meeting glass felt obscene in the silence. "Target you." Her voice emerged smaller than she intended, and she despised herself for the weakness. She forced steel into her words. "James, I fell in love with you. I never asked you for anything. Not once." He laughed, and the sound was more savage than anything she'd ever heard from the man who'd once read poetry to her in bed. "You mentioned your student loan debt exactly once. Very casual, very strategic. Just enough to let me know you were financially vulnerable. That's how it starts, isn't it? Plant the seed. Make the mark think helping you was his idea." Naomi felt something fundamental shatter inside her chest. Some core belief about who this man was and what they'd meant to each other. The lawyer was already in the room. Nomi hadn't noticed him at first, standing silent in the corner like a vulture waiting for something to die. But now she saw him clearly. Expensive suit, leather briefcase, the predatory stillness of someone paid to destroy people with paperwork. "Mr. Brennan here has prepared some documents for you to sign," James said, setting down his glass with a soft click that sounded like a gavel. "A non-disclosure agreement. You'll agree never to contact me again, never to claim I'm the father of those children, and never to mention my name in connection with this situation." Situation. Nomi's voice cracked. "James, these are your children. Our children." "There was someone before you," James continued as though she hadn't spoken, his voice taking on the rehearsed quality of a speech he'd given before. 3 years ago. She was convincing too. Pregnancy test, ultrasound images, doctor's appointments, tears, the entire performance. She extracted $500,000 from me before I discovered the truth. There was no baby. There never had been." He finally looked at her directly, and his hazel green eyes, the same eyes she'd traced with her fingertips on lazy Sunday mornings, were empty of recognition. "So you'll forgive me if I don't take your word for it." "I'm not her," Nomi whispered. "That's exactly what she said." James nodded to the lawyer. "Mr. Brennan will escort you out once you've signed. If you refuse, or if you ever attempt to contact me again, We'll pursue legal action for fraud and extortion." The room tilted. Nomi gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "You know me. You know I would never. I thought I knew you." James's voice softened for just a moment, and something that might have been regret flickered across his face. Then it hardened again. "I was wrong." The lawyer stepped forward, papers rustling. Nomi looked down at the ultrasound images still clutched in her hand. Two tiny forms, curled together like they were already protecting each other from the world that was rejecting them. She thought about fighting. About lawyers of her own, paternity tests, court orders. But she was a nurse living paycheck to paycheck, and James Watson owned half the city's real estate. She could already see how this would end. Buried under legal fees she couldn't afford, her name dragged through tabloids, her children born into a war zone. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "I never did." Then this should be easy to sign. Nomi looked at him one last time, searching for any trace of the man who'd held her during thunderstorms, who'd brought her soup when she worked double shifts, who'd told her she was the only person who'd ever seen the real him. He was gone. Or maybe he'd never been real at all. She signed the papers with shaking hands and walked out of James Watson's office, leaving the ultrasound images scattered on his desk like abandoned promises. Security escorted her to the street. It was starting to rain. The droplets hit her face, cold and indifferent, mixing with the tears she couldn't hold back anymore. Nomi stood on the sidewalk outside Watson Tower, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach where two lives were growing. Lives their father had just legally denied. Around her, the city moved with brutal efficiency. Business people rushed past with umbrellas, taxis honked. The world continued as though hers hadn't just ended. She had nowhere to go but forward. The county hospital's fluorescent lights were unforgiving at 3 a.m. Nomi lay in the delivery room, alone except for the rotating shift of nurses who checked her dilation with clinical efficiency and disappeared again. No partner in the corner, no hand to hold, no one to tell her she was doing well or that it would all be worth it. Just her, the pain, and the arithmetic of survival she'd been calculating for 7 months. The contractions came in waves that made her previous understanding of pain seem laughable. Between them, she did the math again. Her savings account had $2,847. Daycare for twins would cost $2,400 per month. Her rent was $1,100. Her car payment was $340. Student loans, $280. Utilities, groceries, diapers. Formula if breastfeeding didn't work. "You're at 10 centimeters, a nurse announced. "Time to push." Nomi pushed, and pushed, and pushed until she thought her body would split apart, until the world narrowed to nothing but the animalistic need to bring these lives into the world even as her mind screamed the impossibility of keeping them fed and safe and whole. One more, Nomi. Come on, one more. Rio came first, small and furious, his cry filling the delivery room with indignant rage. They placed him on her chest for just a moment, long enough for her to see his face, the distinctive dimple in his chin that was pure Watson genetics, before whisking him away to prepare for his sister. 12 minutes later, Zara followed, quieter but no less determined, her tiny fist already wrapped around Nomi's finger like she was claiming her place in the world. "Beautiful babies," the nurse said, and Nomi heard the unspoken question beneath the words. "Where's the father?" She didn't answer. She was too busy memorizing their faces, these two miracles who just made her life infinitely harder and infinitely more precious. The hospital kept them for 48 hours. Nomi learned to nurse twins, to change diapers one-handed, to function on 20-minute intervals of sleep. She learned that breast milk could flow while tears did, that love and terror could exist in the same heartbeat, that she could be simultaneously the strongest and most fragile she'd ever been. On the third day, they sent her home with 2 car seats, a folder of discharge instructions, and a follow-up appointment she'd already calculated she could barely afford. Her apartment had never looked smaller, or more empty. That night, while both babies screamed in stereo and her body ached from stitches and exhaustion, Nomi made herself a promise. She would never tell her children their father hadn't wanted them. She would raise them to know their worth, to understand that someone else's inability to love them was never a reflection of their value. She would survive this. And more than that, she would make sure they thrived. even if it killed her. The first weeks were a blur of feeding schedules and diaper changes and the crushing exhaustion that came from sleeping in 40-minute increments. Her mother helped when she could, but she lived 2 hours away and had her own health issues. Friends offered support that evaporated once they realized how relentless newborn twins could be. Nomi returned to work at 6 weeks because she had no choice. The hospital offered minimal maternity leave, and her savings were already gone. She pumped milk in supply closets, worked night shifts because the differential pay was slightly higher, and picked up her babies from the neighbor who watched them for less than she should have charged. Every dollar was accounted for. Every expense weighed against necessity. New shoes for herself? Impossible. The twins needed formula to supplement when her milk supply couldn't keep up. A night out with friends? Laughable. That money went to co-pays for well-baby visits. But when Rio smiled for the first time, a gummy, dimpled grin that was heartbreakingly like his father's, Nomi knew she'd made the right choice. These children were hers. Wholly, completely, irrevocably hers. And she would move heaven and earth to give them the life they deserved. Kindergarten registration required a birth certificate. Nomi sat at her kitchen table at midnight, the form spread before her like an accusation. Father's name. Blank. Father's signature. Blank. Medical history. Paternal side. Blank. Across the room, Zara and Rio slept in their shared bedroom. 5 years of life packed into a space barely large enough for their twin beds and the bookshelf Nomi had built from crates. She picked up the pen, then set it down again. Every day, she saw James Watson in their faces. Rio had inherited his hazel green eyes exactly. That particular shade that shifted between gold and forest depending on the light. The Watson dimple marked his chin like a signature. When he concentrated on his building blocks, his expression turned thoughtful and distant in a way that made Nomi's chest ache with recognition. Zara had his determined jawline, his way of tilting her head when she listened, his uncanny ability to read people's emotions. At 5, she was already fiercely protective of her brother, already negotiating with the world like she was born understanding how to close deals. They asked about their father sometimes. Not often, but enough. Why don't we have a daddy? Rio had asked last month, watching another child get picked up by a man who swung him into the air. Nomi had knelt to his level, her prepared answer ready. Some families have 2 parents, some have 1, some have grandparents or aunts and uncles. We have each other, and that's what makes us a family. But where is he? Zara had pressed, her adult-like intuition already sensing the careful evasion. He couldn't be here. The truth, if not the whole truth. But that's okay, because I love you enough for 2 parents. Rio had seemed satisfied. Zara had studied her with those 2 knowing eyes and said nothing. Now, filling out the kindergarten forms, Nomi wondered how long she could maintain the deliberate silence. How long before they Googled their mother's name and found tabloid remnants from 5 years ago. Nurse claims real estate mogul fathered her twins. Watson denies all claims. How long before they did the math and realized their birthday fell exactly 9 months after the last time their mother had been photographed with James Watson at a charity gala. She left the father's information blank and signed her name. Outside her window, the city glittered with wealth and possibility. Somewhere in one of those glass towers, James Watson was probably working late, building his empire higher, his life moving forward unburdened by the 2 miracles sleeping 30 feet from where Nomi sat. She wondered if he ever thought about them. If he ever calculated the due date and realized 2 children existed with his DNA, his features, his genetic legacy walking around unacknowledged. Probably not. Rich men were good at compartmentalizing inconvenient truths. Nomi finished the forms, checked on the sleeping children one more time, and went to bed. Tomorrow was a 12-hour shift at the hospital, then pickup from after-school care, then dinner, baths, bedtime stories, and the careful choreography of single parenthood that she'd perfected through necessity. She didn't have time for old wounds. But sometimes late at night they bled anyway. She dreamed of rain that night. Of standing outside Watson Tower while security blocked the entrance. Of ultrasound images scattered on expensive carpet. Of hazel green eyes looking through her like she was nothing. She woke at dawn to Rio climbing into her pull-out sofa bed, his small body warm and trusting against hers. "Mommy, I had a bad dream." "Me too, baby," she whispered, holding him close. "But we're okay now." And they were. Broken in places, struggling in others, but fundamentally okay. She'd made sure of that. The Watson Foundation's Youth Sports Initiative was James's favorite charity event. Not because he particularly cared about children's athletics, but because it generated excellent press and offered legitimate tax advantages. He attended every year, shook hands with coaches, posed for photos with kids holding soccer balls, and wrote checks that made local news. This year's event was held at Riverside Park, the spring afternoon perfect for the carefully orchestrated chaos of youth soccer. James stood on the sidelines with his PR director, half listening to a rundown of which local politicians were in attendance and which photo opportunities would play best. "And the U6 division is about to start their scrimmage game. We should get some shots of you with." James stopped listening. On the field, a group of 5-year-olds were organizing into approximate positions, their tiny bodies swallowed by oversized jerseys. Most were a tangle of confused energy, but one boy caught his attention immediately. He moved with unusual coordination for his age, positioning himself carefully, his small face set in concentration. When he turned, scanning the field with tactical awareness that seemed impossible for a kindergartner, James felt something cold slide down his spine. Hazel green eyes. The exact shade that looked back at him from the mirror every morning. "Who's that?" James heard himself ask, his voice strange in his own ears. "Which one?" "Number 7. The boy with—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The PR director consulted her tablet. "That's Rio Peterson, one of our scholarship recipients. Single mother, works as a nurse. Sweet kid, coach says he's got real natural talent." Peterson. The name detonated in James's chest like a grenade. He watched the boy, Rio, steal the ball and navigate toward the goal with surprising skill. When Rio smiled at a teammate's encouragement, the Watson dimple appeared in his chin exactly where James had inherited it from his own father, and from his grandfather before that. A distinctive genetic marker. Unmistakable. "Mr. Watson. Are you all right?" James wasn't all right. He was watching a 5-year-old boy with his eyes, his dimple, his athletic instincts, playing soccer under a name James had tried to erase from his memory. 5 years old. The timeline assembled itself with brutal precision. Nomi's pregnancy announcement had been in November. She would have been due in. "I need the details on that scholarship recipient," James said abruptly. "The Peterson boy. Full file." "Sir." "Now." The PR director hurried away, and James stood frozen on the sidelines, unable to look away from the child who was suddenly everywhere. Sprinting, laughing, celebrating a goal with a joy so pure it felt like an accusation. A girl appeared beside Rio, slightly smaller, with curly dark hair and that same determined jawline. She high-fived her brother, because they had to be siblings, twins maybe. And when she turned, James saw Nomi's eyes looking out of a 5-year-old face. His knees felt weak. "Here's the file," the PR director said, returning with her tablet. "Rio and Zara Peterson, born April 14th. Mother is Nomi Peterson, registered nurse at County General. Father," she paused. "Father is listed as unknown on the application." Unknown. James did the math again, hoping for a different answer. November to April. 9 months. Exactly 9 months from the last time he'd seen Nomi, the day he'd accused her of fraud and had her escorted from his office by security. The day he'd been so certain she was lying. Across the field, Rio Peterson looked up, and for one impossible moment, their eyes met. The boy smiled, a stranger's friendly acknowledgement of an adult watching the game, and James felt the full weight of 5 years crash down on him. He'd been wrong. Catastrophically, irrevocably wrong. And somewhere in this city, Nomi Peterson had raised his children alone while he'd congratulated himself on avoiding another con. James pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed his private investigator. "I need you to find someone," he said, his voice barely steady. "And I need to know everything." The investigation took 2 weeks. Marcus Chen was the best, discreet, thorough, unburdened by sentiment. But when he walked into James's private study with the dossier, even his professional neutrality seemed shaken. "You're not going to like this," Marcus said, setting the folder on the desk. James had already poured himself scotch. His hand trembled as he opened the file. Subject: Nomi Peterson, age 31. The first page was a photo. Nomi pushing a double stroller through a parking lot, nursing scrubs visible under a worn coat, her face exhausted but determined. James barely recognized her. The woman in the photo had aged a decade in 5 years. Employment: registered nurse, County General Hospital. Current salary: $68,000 per year. Works primarily night shifts. Frequently works 50 to 60-hour weeks. Residence: one-bedroom apartment, Riverside District. Rent: $1,100 per month. Children share the bedroom. Subject sleeps on convertible sofa in living room. Something cracked in James's chest. Financial status: checking account typically under $500 by month's end. $42,000 in student loan debt. No savings. Never applied for state assistance. Never filed for child support. The last phrase was highlighted. Children: Rio James Peterson and Zara Marie Peterson. Born April 14, 2020. Father unknown on birth certificates. No paternity claim ever filed. James paused. Rio James. She'd given their son his name as a middle name, even after everything. The daily schedule made his stomach turn. 5:30 a.m. Wake, prepare breakfast and lunches 6:45 a.m. Drop children at before-school care 7:30 a.m. Begin shift at County General 7 p.m. End shift. Pick up children 9 p.m. Children asleep 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Meal prep, housework, laundry 11:30 p.m. Sleep. On overnight shifts, the children stayed with a 67-year-old neighbor Nomi, compensated with grocery shopping and household help. The photos that followed were damning in their mundanity. Nomi at the hospital. Nomi volunteering at the twin school despite working full-time. Nomi at the park, at the library, doing everything. Alone. Notable finding: no romantic relationship since November 2019. No dating activity. Life appears entirely focused on work and childcare. Financial analysis: 87% of income spent on rent, childcare, and necessities. Remaining 13% goes toward children's activities. Soccer for Rio, art classes for Zara. Subject has not purchased new clothing for herself in approximately 18 months. The final page was a photocopy of the NDA James had made her sign. Marcus had highlighted one clause. Party A agrees never to claim James Watson as the biological father of any children, born or unborn. Beneath it, Nomi's shaky signature, dated the same day he'd thrown her out of his office. "There's more," Marcus said quietly. "Medical records. Rio has AB negative blood. Same as yours. Only present in roughly 1% of the population." James set down the file carefully, as if it might explode. "There's zero doubt, Mr. Watson. Those are your children. And that woman spent the last 5 years raising them alone on a nurse's salary while you built a new high-rise downtown." The silence was suffocating. "She never asked me for anything," James said finally, his voice hollow. "Not once in 5 years." "No, sir. She didn't." James felt the full weight of his cowardice settle on his shoulders. "What do I do?" Marcus looked at him with something almost like pity. "That's above my pay grade, Mr. Watson. But if I were you, I'd start with a very good apology." After Marcus left, James sat alone with the dossier, reading it again and again. Somewhere across the city, his 5-year-old children were going to bed, and their mother was collapsing onto a second-hand sofa, exhausted from being both parents because he'd been too damaged and too proud to see the truth. He'd spent 5 years protecting himself from a con that was never happening. And in doing so, he'd committed the real crime. James pulled out his laptop and began to write. "Dear Nomi." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Nomi found it leaning against her apartment door when she got home from her shift. Cream-colored paper with her name written in handwriting that still, after 5 years, made her heart stutter painfully. She stood in the hallway, grocery bags cutting into her hands, staring at it like it might bite. Inside, Mrs. Rodriguez was reading to the twins. Nomi could hear Zara's delighted laughter, could picture Rio curled against the elderly woman who'd become their unofficial grandmother. She picked up the letter and went inside. "Mommy." Rio launched himself at her legs while Zara gave her a more measured hug, already learning to protect herself from disappointment, already her father's daughter in ways that made Nomi ache. After Mrs. Rodriguez left and the twins were occupied with cartoons, Nomi stood in her kitchen and looked at the envelope. She knew what it probably contained. An apology, maybe. An explanation, definitely. Perhaps a check. His money finally offered now that he believed, now that it was too late to matter. She set it on the counter unopened and started washing dishes. The letter stayed there through Wednesday. Through Thursday. Through the weekend when she meal prepped and attended Rio's soccer practice, watching her son score 2 goals with his father's athletic grace. She set bills next to it. Grocery lists. School permission slips. The envelope became part of the landscape, simultaneously invisible and unavoidable. "What's that?" Zara asked Sunday morning, her observant eyes missing nothing. "Just mail, baby." "It has fancy writing." "I will when I'm ready," Nomi said, though she didn't have a good answer. Because she was terrified? Because once she opened it, something would change? Because 5 years of careful numbness would crack apart? Monday night, after the twins were asleep, Nomi sat at her kitchen table and stared at the letter. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum. She thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, naive enough to believe love could bridge any gap, hopeful enough to see ultrasound images as proof of something beautiful rather than evidence in an accusation. That woman had died in James Watson's office. The woman who'd risen from those ashes had delivered twins alone, had worked double shifts while healing from childbirth, had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep. She'd learned to be both mother and father, to answer questions about daddies with practiced evasions, to see James's face in her children every single day without letting the anger consume her. She was stronger now. Strong enough to raise 2 children alone. Strong enough to watch other families with their intact structures and feel grateful rather than bitter. Was she strong enough to read this letter? Nomi picked up the envelope. It was thick, multiple pages. She turned it over and saw the wax seal embossed with the Watson family crest. Even his apology was expensive. She set it back down. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The unopened letter could contain anything. Regret, remorse, excuses, money, demands. Once she opened it, reality would collapse into whatever truth lay inside, and she'd have to decide what to do with it. Right now she had equilibrium. Her life was hard but stable. Her children were happy. The letter represented chaos, the past crashing into her carefully constructed present. She wasn't ready. The letter stayed on the counter through Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, Rio asked over breakfast, "Mommy, do you think our daddy knows about us?" Nomi's spoon froze. "Why do you ask that, baby?" Marcus's dad was in the army and didn't know Marcus was born. But then he came home and they were a family. Rio's hazel green eyes, his father's eyes, looked at her with devastating hope. Maybe our daddy doesn't know either. Maybe if he knew, he'd come. Across the table, Zara watched with that eerie perception, already understanding more than a 5-year-old should. "It's more complicated than that, sweetie." "But maybe." Nomi looked at her son, at the hope that was going to get crushed eventually, and felt something shift inside her chest. The letter wasn't going to disappear. James Watson wasn't going to disappear. He'd found them somehow, and now he wanted something. She owed it to her children to at least know what. That night, after the twins were asleep, Nomi finally opened the letter. The letter was 7 pages long. Nomi read it once in disbelief, then again in mounting anger, then a third time with something that might have been recognition of genuine remorse. James laid it all out, the previous relationship that had traumatized him, his paranoia, his catastrophic misjudgment, the charity event where he'd seen Rio, the investigation, and the devastating realization of what he'd done. The letter was detailed, confessional, and concluded with a request that felt both presumptuous and heartbreaking. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I destroyed any claim I might have had to those children the day I called you a liar. But if there's any chance you might allow me to know them, To try to be the father I should have been from the beginning, I'm asking. Not because I deserve it. I don't. But because they might deserve to have a father who, despite his catastrophic failure, wants to try. The letter included no check. No offer of money. Just a phone number written in the same handwriting that had once left love notes on her pillow. Nomi set the letter down and stared at her kitchen ceiling, emotions warring inside her. Part of her wanted to call immediately and unleash 5 years of rage. Part of her wanted to throw the letter away. Part of her, the part she hated most, wanted to hear his voice and feel something other than careful numbness. But the biggest part, the mother part that had expanded to fill every corner of her being, thought about Rio's question. Maybe if he knew, he'd come. Her children deserved a father. But they also deserved protection from someone who could hurt them the way James had hurt her. 3 days later, she called the number. James answered on the first ring. Nomi. Don't. The word came out sharp. Don't say my name like that. Like we're still people who have the right to each other's intimacy. Silence. Then. I'm sorry. You're right. I read your letter. Thank you. His voice cracked. Thank you for even opening it. I didn't do it for you. Nomi forced steel into her words. I did it for Rio and Zara. They deserve to make their own decisions about whether they want you in their lives. I understand. I don't think you do. 5 years of carefully controlled anger suddenly found its voice. You don't understand what it was like to give birth alone because the man I loved called me a liar. You don't understand night shifts with mastitis and a crying baby on each hip. You don't understand working 50-hour weeks and still choosing between groceries and electricity. You don't understand answering questions about daddies with lies designed to protect children from rejection. You're right. I don't understand. But I want to. I don't care what you want. Nomi's voice was ice. For 5 years this has been about what I want, what they need. And if you think one letter erases that, you're still the same arrogant man who threw me out. Nomi. Here are my terms. She cut him off. You want to meet your children? Fine. But it happens on my schedule, in neutral locations, supervised. You will attend therapy. Your own individual therapy to address whatever trauma made you destroy your family. You will undergo a paternity test through my lawyer, legally establishing your rights and responsibilities. And most importantly, you will respect that I am their mother, I make the decisions, and if I decide your presence is damaging them, you walk away. No lawyers, no custody battle, no using your wealth as a weapon. Agreed. All of it. I'm not finished. Nomi took a breath. You want to show up now? You show up for everything. Soccer games and art shows and parent-teacher conferences. You show up when Rio has nightmares and Zara needs help with homework. You show up for the boring, hard, unglamorous parts of parenting that don't come with photo opportunities. Yes. Absolutely yes. And you will never tell them the real reason you weren't there from the beginning. As far as they know, we were together, things didn't work out, and we're trying now. They don't need to know their father thought they were a scam. This pause was longer. That's generous. It's not generous. It's protective. They don't deserve that burden. You're right. James's voice was thick. When can I meet them? Not yet. First you find a therapist. Then we do the paternity test. Then I decide if you're ready. How long? As long as it takes. You waited 5 years. You can wait a few more months. After she hung up, Nomi sat in her kitchen and cried for the first time since the twins were born. Not because she was weak, but because she'd just done the hardest thing she'd ever done. Opened the door to the man who'd broken her heart, risking the fragile peace she'd built, for children who deserved a chance at knowing their father. She just hoped she wouldn't regret it. The park was neutral territory. Public enough to feel safe, private enough for honest conversation. James arrived 15 minutes early, pacing near the playground like a defendant waiting for a verdict. He'd been in therapy for 6 weeks. The paternity test had come back with 99.99% certainty. Nomi had finally agreed to this meeting with conditions so strict they'd required a written agreement. He could meet the twins. He could not tell them he was their father yet. He was being introduced as Mommy's friend James, until Nomi decided they were ready for the truth. He saw them before they saw him. Nomi walked across the grass with a child on each side, and James's breath caught. Photos hadn't prepared him for the reality. The way Rio's gait matched his own, the way Zara's serious expression mirrored his childhood photos. "Remember what we talked about," Nomi was saying. "This is my friend, and he wants to meet you. You don't have to hug him or even talk much if you don't want to." "Okay." Both children nodded, their eyes already on James, curious and assessing. Nomi stopped a respectful distance away. "Rio, Zara, this is James. James, these are my children." "Our children," James wanted to say, but the agreement had been explicit. He earned nothing. Everything was Nomi's to give. "Hi," he managed, his voice embarrassingly unsteady. "It's really nice to meet you both." Rio, braver or perhaps less intuitive, stepped forward. "Do you like soccer?" "I do. I heard you're really good at it. I scored 3 goals last game." Pride lit up Rio's face, and James saw himself at that age. "That's amazing. Maybe you could show me some moves." Rio looked to his mother for permission. Nomi nodded, and suddenly James had a 5-year-old demonstrating how to dribble an imaginary ball, narrating his technique with endearing seriousness. Zara hung back, watching James with knowing eyes. "You must be the artist," James said gently. "Your mom told me you love to draw." "I like painting better. Drawing is just practice for painting." "That's very wise. Mommy says practice makes permanent, not perfect." James glanced at Nomi, who was watching this interaction with protectiveness and something he couldn't quite read. They spent an hour at the park. James pushed them on swings, helped Rio navigate the monkey bars, sat on a bench while Zara showed him her sketchbook filled with surprisingly sophisticated drawings for a kindergartner. It was the best and worst hour of his life. Seeing everything he'd missed made real in the faces of 2 children who should have known him from birth. As the visit was winding down, Zara, who'd been quietly observant throughout, suddenly spoke up. "Are you our daddy?" The playground seemed to stop. Nomi froze. James felt his heart slam against his ribs. "Zara," Nomi started. "It's okay," James said quietly. He looked at this perceptive child who'd seen through their careful charade and made a split-second decision. Lies would poison everything. "Yes. I am. Why didn't you believe Mom?" The question landed like a knife between his ribs. Beside him, Nomi had gone pale. James could have deflected. Could have said, "It's complicated," or "I'll tell you when you're older." But Zara's eyes, Nomi's eyes looking out of his child's face, demanded honesty. "Because I was scared," he said, his voice breaking. "Something bad had happened to me before, and I let that fear make me wrong about something very important. I didn't believe your mom when she told me about you, and that was the biggest mistake of my life." "Did you make Mommy cry?" James's eyes met Nomi's across the playground. She wasn't crying now, but he could see the memories reflected in her face. The rain, the lobby, the absolute devastation. "Yes," he whispered. "I made your mommy very sad." Zara considered this with 5-year-old gravity. Then, "Are you going to make her cry again?" "I'm going to try very hard not to." "That's not an answer," Zara said, and James realized his daughter was already smarter than he'd ever been. "You're right. The truth is I don't know. But I promise I'll try to be better. And if I do make her cry, it won't be because I didn't care. It'll be because I'm still learning how to be the person you all deserve." Rio, who'd been listening with growing understanding, suddenly asked, "Are you going to live with us now?" "No, buddy. Your mom and I are." James struggled for words. "We're not together like that. But I'd like to be in your life if you want me to be." "For soccer games?" "For everything." That night, after James left, Zara crawled into bed beside Nomi while Rio was brushing his teeth. "I like him," she said quietly. "But I'm still mad at him for making you sad." Nomi pulled her daughter close. "You know what? That's okay. You can be both those things at once." "Can you?" "Yeah, baby. I can. 2 years later, the soccer championship was held under lights that turned the field into an arena. Nomi stood on the sidelines, her nurse's scrubs covered by a jacket, her hair pulled back after a long shift. Beside her, James wore jeans and a team hoodie, his real estate empire temporarily forgotten in favor of watching his son play center forward. "He's going to score," James murmured. "Watch, he's positioning himself perfectly." "He learned that from watching you," Nomi said. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't accusation either. Just fact. 2 years of supervised visits had become joint birthday parties, joint parent-teacher conferences. James attending Zara's art show on a Tuesday evening, sitting beside Nomi and genuinely engaging with their daughter's creative process. James showing up for Rio's soccer games, even the inconvenient ones, even the ones that conflicted with business meetings. 2 years of therapy, both individual and eventually, tentatively, together, had taught them how to communicate without the weight of their history crushing every conversation. They'd learned to co-parent, to make decisions together, to disagree without destroying. They weren't together. Might never be together. The romantic relationship they'd had was dead, killed by betrayal and time and the impossible gap between who they'd been and who they'd become. But they'd built something else. Something harder won and more durable. Partnership. "Mom. Dad." Rio called from the field, waving at them both. "Watch this." "Dad." It still made James's breath catch every time. Rio executed a perfect play, exactly as James had taught him, and scored the winning goal. The crowd erupted, and James found himself grabbing Nomi's hand without thinking, their shared joy temporarily erasing the complicated history. She didn't pull away. After the game, they took the twins for ice cream, a tradition they developed over these 2 years. Zara ordered chocolate with rainbow sprinkles and told them about the mural she was helping paint at school. Rio recounted the game play by play, his excitement infectious. They looked like a family. Not the traditional kind, not the kind from picture frames and greeting cards, but a family nonetheless. Later, after James had driven them home and helped carry sleepy children upstairs, he and Nomi stood in her apartment doorway, the same apartment she still lived in because she'd refused his offers of financial help, his attempts to make up for lost time with money. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For today. For all of this. You earned it." Nomi's voice was softer than it had been 2 years ago. The sharp edges of her anger had worn smooth. Not from forgetting but from the daily proof that he was trying. "I'll never stop earning it." "I know." And she did know. She'd watched him show up again and again, watched him put his children first, watched him become the father he should have been from the beginning. It didn't erase what he'd done. Nothing could. But it was building something new from the wreckage. Not the love story they'd had before, but something more honest. Something built on proof rather than promises. "Nomi." James hesitated. "Do you think someday we could be more than this? More than just co-parents?" She looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd broken her heart and was slowly, painstakingly trying to heal it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I know I don't hate you anymore. That's something. That's everything." After he left, Nomi checked on her sleeping children. Rio curled around his soccer ball, his face peaceful. Zara with her sketchbook on her nightstand, her features a perfect blend of both her parents. They had a father now. Not perfect but present. Not who he should have been at the beginning, but who he'd chosen to become. And Nomi. She'd proven something to herself over these 7 years. That she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that love could survive in new forms, that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to rebuild. Standing in the doorway of her children's room, watching them sleep, Nomi Peterson realized something profound. She had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to her. And in surviving she'd built a life worth living. Not the one she'd planned, but one that was wholly, beautifully her own. The future was uncertain. Always had been. But for the first time in 7 years, uncertain didn't feel like a threat. It felt like possibility. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment that seemed like rock bottom but turned out to be the beginning of something beautiful? Remember, you're never as alone as you feel, and hope is always possible, even in the darkest moments. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next.